Hello everyone and welcome back to the Legal Insight podcast by HHQ. Now we are now running on episode 37. I think it's going to be 37 because there may be a few episodes in between talking about other topics. Maybe ESG is coming up. So we are expanding our podcast, right?
Amazing.
So this is a special one because we will be focusing on the second installment following the very recent release of 3 new guidelines by the Department of Personal Data Protection on 30th April 2026. Now these 3 guidelines, just to refresh everyone, are first the DPIA Guideline, which is the Data Protection Impact Assessment Guideline. You can go back to the previous episode to have a listen about what that is. The second one, which is what we're going to dive in today, which is Automated Decision Making Profile and Profiling Guideline, or the ADMP Guideline. And the third one, which we'll cover in the next episode, will be the Data Protection by Design Guideline, or the DPIA Guideline. Right, now in the previous episode, Johnson and Khai discussed at length about the first guideline, the DPIA guideline. It was particularly technical and interesting because the DPIA really forms the foundation for how organizations should actually assess personal data protection risks arising from specific processing operations. Now, go back to listen to the episode for the DPIA guidelines because it forms the foundation of what we'll be discussing today. Now, the ADMP, we're quite literally speaking different languages within the realm of Malaysia's personal data protection landscape. These are not just abstract regulatory concepts. They actually represent a much broader shift in how organizations should think about data, technology, automation, AI, and also individual rights of your data subjects, right? So we're very happy to have Johnson and Khai again, our head of technology practice group and our co-head of technology practice group at HHQ, back with us today to dissect the topic and help us, especially legal and in-house teams, to develop a broad and deeper understanding of what the ADMP guideline is intended to achieve, its general scope, and how it may operate in practice. Right, ultimately, this is about just making sense of everything that's happening in the PDP space. So ladies and gentlemen, let's jump into the ADMP guideline.
Sure.
Johnson, let's start with the most basic but also probably most important question today. We're now using another acronym, the ADMP, in a list of many acronyms we've covered in the past 2 episodes. And for many people listening, especially for those who are not deep in the PDP law or technology regulation landscape, this sounds technical and frankly quite intimidating. So before we go any deeper, please let us know what is ADMP and help us set the stage and maybe give us some comfort here.
Yeah, amazing. Good to see you, Zach.
Yeah.
Always happy to see you. So yes, back to ADMP. ADMP, I would say that is a combination of 2 very broad concepts. So ADM is a short form for automated decision making, and P means profiling. As mentioned earlier, ADMP is really a combination of 2 concepts. Let's start with the first concept, which is ADM. ADM, essentially we are saying that where a system will be making a decision automatically. So of course, when we are saying that the system or the particular program, they are making automatic decision, we are not saying that there's no human involvement. Potentially, there may be some very minor human touch point because ultimately you still need human to be the one providing the personal data, providing the data so that the system will be making the decision. But ultimately, when it comes to ADM, we are referring to a system where that system will be making decisions entirely on its own. So when it comes to profiling, it's a different concept. Profiling, we are referring to a system where it has the ability to make inference to actually predict and also provide certain insight about certain data subjects.
That's helpful. And let me follow up on that. From what you have explained, ADMP sounds very AI-driven and closely connected to AI.
Yeah.
So is it right to say that ADMP is essentially referring to AI processing, or is there a more nuanced distinction that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the most important questions because if you actually take a deeper look into the ADMP guideline that was just released on the 30th April, they make it very clear that this guideline, the main focus is on ADMP activities where AI is being used to process personal data. So one thing that I want to emphasize is not all ADMP will actually involve AI.
Yeah.
Even though most of the ADMP at this moment it will involve AI, but there are still a bunch of ADMP processing activities that may not involve AI. Why do I say so? Because some of the ADMP is actually mainly based on rule-based system. For example, let's say a bank they will be using ADMP for them to actually reject or to approve a loan. But they may not be using AI at all. It can just be a simple rule-based.
It's like a logic-based thing.
Yes, correct. Saying that, for example, if your salary level is below a certain threshold, then automatically the system will just reject you. So they may not be using AI at all. Just a very simple algorithm. So we can actually understand why the ADMP, they make it so clear by saying that the key focus is on AI. Because we know the moment ADMP is being empowered is by AI, the risk is a lot higher. Because right now we are actually referring to certain inference, the profiling, they may potentially impact, they may potentially affect the data subject on a very significant level. That is why when it comes to ADMP that is being AI enabled, it actually requires deeper and also more serious regulatory attention.
Thanks, Johnson. Now, Khai, having understood what ADMP actually is, can you help us paint the picture of how ADMP fits into the wider DPIA framework? From the previous episode, we actually understood that ADMP is one of the qualitative factors to consider when determining whether a DPIA assessment is required. Now, how should organizations connect these two guidelines together?
Yep. Thanks, Zach. Happy to be here in the second installment of our trilogy.
Yeah.
So this is, it took me a bit of time, quite some time to actually connect the dots as well. We have DPIA on the one hand and we have ADMP on the other hand.
Yeah, you say you took a while, but it's actually been only less than a week since the guideline's been launched.
Well, while I was reading it, it took me longer than expected.
Yeah.
Right. If you remember in the previous episode, I actually mentioned that when it comes to the assessment of whether a company needs to carry out DPIA, you need to go through two types of assessments, right? The quantitative assessment and also a qualitative assessment. Quantitative assessment is very straightforward. If I process in a particular processing activity, the personal data of data subjects above a certain number of head counts, then I will have to carry out DPIA already. But when it comes to the qualitative, that's where things may be, company needs to exercise a bit of judgment and a little bit of assessment. They need to see whether the particular processing activity carries risk or it will pose high risk to protection of personal data. So one of the assessment factor listed under the qualitative assessment section is whether an organization uses automated decision-making and profiling in their processing activity. On the one hand, the ADMP guideline actually tells organization what kind of automated decision-making and profiling processing activity would actually be considered as high risk, which would then actually trigger the DPIA guideline. So DPIA guideline will help organizations to assess how do I actually carry out, how do I assess the risk, and how do I come up with a report essentially to suggest risk mitigation factors to then reduce the risk and mitigate the risk in relation to, in this case, the ADMP processing activity that data controllers will actually be deploying. So companies, in simple terms, you can look at it this way. Whenever you are carrying out any processing activities involving ADMP, that is a trigger, that is a signal for you to then go to the ADMP guideline to assess, okay, this current processing activities of mine that involves ADMP, would it actually pose high risk to protection of personal data of data subjects? If the answer is yes, then the flowchart immediately that will bring you to the DPIA guideline. Okay, then I need to carry out a DPIA. How should I be carrying out DPIA? What do I need to carry out DPIA? So essentially, that's the relationship between the two guidelines. It's not as simple as for companies to just ask themselves, do I actually use ADMP do I actually deploy ADMP in my processing? But rather, you actually need to dig deeper and see whether the particular ADMP poses any high risk to protection of personal data.
Right. So now let's actually dig a little bit deeper on this, right? Does that mean that all ADMP would require a DPIA assessment, or is it only the ADMP with significantly high risk? And if it's the latter, how should companies actually assess whether the threshold is met for the assessment?
So, Zach, thanks for the question. As mentioned just now, only the data processing activities involving ADMP that poses high risk to the protection of personal data would actually require a DPIA. If you look at the guideline says that an ADMP processing activity would poses high risk to the protection of personal data of data subjects only if it will actually result in legal effects concerning the data subjects or significantly affect the data subject. So, but reading that alone, it doesn't mean much, right? The guideline actually unpacked further. So, what does it mean by legal effect and also significant effect, right? The guideline, again, if we look into the guideline, it says that legal effect refers to any decisions that may actually affect a person's legal status or legal rights.
Yes.
For example, if a company actually uses an automated CV filtering system, right? So they actually deploy a system that automatically screens through all the CVs that may have been sent to the company. So they will actually read through the content of the CV and perhaps labeled and marked certain data points and use and through all these data points that have been marked, that have been processed, the system then decides based on certain criteria. They actually then decides, okay, this candidate will not be too suitable for the company. So I will not schedule an interview. I will not even pass this to the HR manager or the hiring manager. But all these CVs that perhaps have a higher score, I will then feed these to the hiring manager for the hiring manager to then schedule an interview. So that's one example where an ADMP processing activity can actually have a legal effect on a person because then it then affects a particular candidate's chances of actually getting hired, right? So the second category is where the ADMP outcome significantly affects the data subjects. So what does it mean again? This may include outcomes that affect the person's circumstances, behavior or choices, I'm quoting the guideline right now, or have a prolonged or permanent impact, or at the most serious level, lead to exclusion or discrimination. So for example, if now we look at a bank. If a bank actually uses, or rather an insurer, let's use insurers as an example. If an insurer actually uses an AI system that calculates based on data and also information provided by a particular customer to calculate the risk level on a particular customer, which then translate to perhaps a higher or lower premium. So in this kind of scenario, this particular ADMP processing would actually carry a significant effect on a particular person because while I may not necessarily be rejected outright, right, but be prohibited or rather be excluded from signing up, from purchasing an insurance, my insurance premium may actually fluctuate. I may actually have to pay higher premium compared to my peers, compared to someone else, just because I have certain habits or I have certain history or I have certain behaviors or I'm from a certain area which got flagged by a particular system as being high risk. So these are examples where ADMP will actually affect the legal rights and status rights and also will actually carry significant effect on a particular customer, on a particular data subjects. And the guideline is trying to address this type of ADMP processing activities.
Thanks, Khai. Now, Johnson, let's shift gears slightly. After understanding the ADMP and the risk involved, one may feel slightly uncomfortable knowing that life decisions now may somehow be influenced or determined by automated decision making and profiling. Like what Khai mentioned, my insurance premium may actually be like 20% higher than yours because
you're fat.
Because I'm fat or because I ride a bicycle to work or something like that, right? Now, whether it is loan approval, insurance underwriting, recruitment screening, or access to certain services, these can be very real and personal outcomes. I can't imagine like my day-to-day decisions or day-to-day circumstances being affected by a robot somewhere, right?
Yes.
So is there any obligation for the data controller to inform individuals if ADMP is involved in these screenings?
You are absolutely right. So if ADMP is being used, the ADMP guideline, they make it very clear by saying that the data subject should be informed. It means it's actually a mandatory requirement. The ADMP guidelines make it very clear by saying that in the event, let's say the company, they are really going to deploy any form of ADMP for that particular processing activities, then the data controller, they have to, they make it very clear, it's written notice, not verbal notice, but written notice, clearly inform the data subjects what decision will be made through that particular ADMP. And more importantly, more than just telling them what are the decisions, they should also be explaining the reason behind that particular decision and also what are the potential consequences, as mentioned by Khai. For example, if a particular insurance company, they have decided to actually deploy or employ ADMP for their premium calculation, then the potential consequences is everyone may have to pay different premium purely because based on the calculation or based on the risk evaluation determined by the AI tool. Ultimately, when it comes to the notice or when it comes to information, the key information they want to understand is it has to be clear, it has to be transparent, and also from a data subject perspective, from a client perspective, from a customer perspective, I need to know very clearly how is my personal data is being used. And then for you, if you have decided to actually deploy ADMP, how is that going to impact me? How is it going to affect me? So that I could actually make a very sound, make a very informed decision as to how am I supposed to proceed further with these processing activities.
Now, this feels as if companies deploying ADMP has almost a higher obligation to or greater transparency threshold to inform data subjects, because traditionally, if data is being processed through human means, like there's no real obligation to inform you, like, okay, your premium is this amount because we've gone through this calculation, or you've been rejected because of these reasons. There's no real obligation. Are you saying that if you deploy ADMP, the transparency requirement is greater?
Yes, correct. I think certainly so. The reason because right now, instead of just using human logic, you actually rely on a tool. And then the particular tool, as I mentioned, you'll be doing profiling, and then they'll be making inference, they'll be making prediction, they will be actually learning from a profile, and then they make decisions with almost no human interaction. So you can actually understand the risk is actually very, very high. You wouldn't want to rely on one particular AI tool to affect your actually livelihood, and also your earning. That is why whenever a company has decided to really use ADMP, especially AI-powered ADMP, they have the obligation to actually inform data subjects.
I understand. That's amazing. Now, let me follow up on that, Johnson. If a data subject is informed that their personal data may be processed through ADMP or AI-powered ADMP, for individuals like us, can we actually say no to ADMP? Can we actually request that a human process it instead, or you're using a different rules to assess my profile?
Yeah, the beauty of Malaysia, the beauty of PDP is everyone can say no. So you can actually say no in the event after reading the notice, after finding out that the particular company will be deploying ADMP to process your personal data, then you actually have the right to say no. You can actually withdraw your consent. Because, as mentioned by Khai earlier, in order for any company to process your personal data, the fundamental rules is I can only process your personal data with your consent or potential I need your explicit consent. Of course, there are some exceptions where I'm still able to process without consent, but those are very, very small and niche exceptions. The general rules is you can only process with consent. After reading the notice, after finding out that your company is going to use ADMP to process my personal data, if I don't feel comfortable, if I don't trust the particular AI tool, if I want human involvement, I can make it very clear by saying that no, I don't give consent to your company to process my personal data, especially using ADMP. Of course, after receiving that particular withdrawal or after hearing from our data subjects, as a company, as a data controller, you have legal obligation to comply. You have to respect the decision. The moment I receive a notice saying that, okay, these data subjects, they don't allow me to process their personal data using ADMP anymore, I have to comply. So of course, when it comes to legal provision, there's always exceptions. But let us not go there, because we do understand that the exceptions is actually just very minor part. And also you can only apply this exception on some very extreme circumstances. Ultimately, if a company, from a general rule of thumb, if you receive a very clear notice, the customer or data subject, they say that I want to withdraw my consent, I don't allow you to process my personal data using ADMP, then you have to respect, you have to comply with that particular request coming from data subjects.
Sure. Now, Khai, let me come to you for this next question, right? Given the risk involved, some organizations may begin to wonder now whether ADMP is discouraged or even prohibited, given such stringent rules and guidelines is being deployed. Is ADMP actually prohibited under the guideline? And in what situations can company actually apply ADMP?
Well, if you have reached this part of the recording, I'm sure you would have you would have understood from our discussion so far that ADMP as a processing activity is actually not prohibited. So it's allowed, but it's just that it comes with certain safeguard and certain obligations on the part of data controllers, as Johnson has highlighted earlier very kindly. So you need to, maybe let me just summarize very, very quickly. So you need to make sure that you have the legal basis to carry out the data processing activity that you want to carry out. And if it involves ADMP, you need to make sure that there is transparency on your part as well, informing data subjects of the particular technology of the ADMP that you are deploying and what are the potential consequences that may actually arise in this case. And data subjects will always be given the right to say no. Again, as Johnson has mentioned just now, you can pretty much say no to everything. And in this case, data controller, if you receive a no from a data subject saying that I don't want you to process my personal data with ADMP, you essentially have to stop that particular processing activities. So now this is where we come to the exceptions, right? Because with every general rule, there's always exceptions. That's what us legal professionals, we like to say. So Johnson touched a little bit on the exception just now. There are exhaustively 3 exceptions in the guideline at this moment. So these are the scenarios where you can actually, for data controllers, you can actually still process personal data using ADMP where there is no consent, in a sense, specific consent by data subjects consenting to the use of ADMP to process their personal data. The first exception is where the processing is necessary for entering into or for the performance of a particular contract between the data controller and also the data subject. I think this doesn't need much elaboration. It's quite self-explanatory. The second one is where the processing is necessary in order for a company to comply with law. So let's say banks, because banks and financial institutions and even law firms, us law firms even, we are under quite strict and stringent obligations under our anti-money laundering law to actually monitor transactions that comes in and through our accounts, right? Especially for financial institutions. They need to monitor all the transactions that are happening under their watch. And in the case of big banks, can you imagine the number of the volume of the transactions that are happening on a daily basis? So surely they will need some level of automated decision making and technology to help them to screen through every transaction. So in this kind of scenario where the screening actually involves automated decision making technology, or rather profiling technology, you can actually rely on this exception to deploy all these things even without explicit and specific consent by the data subjects. And last exceptions, the irony is that the last exception is where you actually have the consent of data subjects. So I would like to think that this is the reason why consent is being stated as an exception is for there to be case-by-case exceptions to be sought by data controller to data subjects, maybe as a one-off to say that, okay, for this particular purpose, because you have requested us to do certain things, I will process your personal data with ADMP. So with that consent, you can actually carry out that one-off processing activity with ADMP.
Sure. Now, Khai, final question from me. For companies actually listening now who are unsure whether their ADMP is high risk or whether they need to proceed with the DPI assessment, can you please give us your top 3 practical steps on how to move forward?
Sure. The recording is getting a little bit long, so I think to just cut it short, I will make my 3 points very, very, very quick. Number 1 is to assess whether you're actually using any ADMP technology at all. If you're not using ADMP in your personal data processing activity, then this guideline is not relevant to you at all. You can just forget about it. But if you do, then you move on to the second point. You have to use the pointers in the guideline to see whether your ADMP processing activity is carrying any what are the impacts, what are the consequences that may actually happen on data subjects. If the impact and the consequences can actually affect the legal rights and also to have significant effect on data subjects, then you need to carry out DPIA. The last pointers that I would give to data controllers is to review, assuming that you are using ADMP, of course, to review your existing transparency framework and also safeguards to see whether you actually meet the requirement of the ADMP guidelines. Again, data subjects, they need to be told that their personal data will actually be processed using ADMP and what are the consequences, and they can actually say no.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. Three very practical steps, right? Thank you, Johnson and Khai, for joining us in this episode. I think it's very clear that ADMP is not merely a technical concept. It's really about how personal data is used by automated systems, especially AI-enabled systems, to profile individuals. Now, having now understood what DPIA and ADMP are, in the next episode of the trilogy, the final episode of this trilogy, we will be focusing on the last guideline, which is the Data Protection by Design guideline. That will be equally important because once organizations understand the risks, the next question is how to build personal data protection into systems, processes, and governance right from the beginning. We'll see you in the next episode.